Well, hello, and I hope that everyone can hear me okay, and that you can see me okay, and that all of those things are happening as they should be. Let me know in the chat if there are any technical difficulties. And with that, welcome to another live stream from Just in Time World. So today we are going to talk about fantasy festivals and why they're important in fantasy and how you can go about building them. Not just festivals, but also rituals and rites and celebrations of all sorts. So let's start with why a festival is important. Festivals help show your culture. They help you to bring your culture to life for people who read your world. In the same way as if you ever come up here to the Nordics where I live and you participate in our festivals here, our big midsummer festivals, you will experience our culture in a very dramatic way. Or if you go to India and you participate in the Festival of Colors, this would be a very unique experience that would allow you to experience the culture of India. In the same way, if you can show your readers the culture of your world in an engaging way, they experience it at a deeper level, and festivals and celebrations and rites allow you to do that. Festivals also give an interesting backdrop to events happening within your story. It also allows you to actually use your culture in specific ways as a part of a plot device. So you can use festivals to demonstrate plot devices, and I will show that to you guys as part of our discussion today. So we will get to some examples of how to use a festival specifically in your plot. Festivals can also help demonstrate your religion and what is important from a religious aspect. If you think about our Christmas and so on, you can see the importance of Christmas to the Christian faith. Or again, the Festival of Colors is tied to Hinduism. I speak under correction, but I believe it's tied to Hinduism. And so you can also see the religion in action. The same applies to your world, of course. The other thing that festivals are great for in a fantasy world is to show the time passing and how much time has passed. If you have an annual festival and the reader experiences the festival for the second time, then it is clear to the reader that a year has passed since the last time that they went through this festival. And then the last thing is that, of course, these kinds of festivals, these kinds of events can help ground the reader in your world and in your characters. These kinds of festivals, because we know what a festival are, because we know what a celebration and a rite and a birthday is, when we see the characters experience this kind of rite and festival and celebration, it brings home to us that there is something in the character that we can feel that we are grounded to, something that we would experience in the same way. Okay, so those are all good reasons to have festivals, rites, and celebrations. But what types of festivals and rites and celebrations? I mean, what are these things that I'm talking about? So William Blowers asks, so kind of like the beating of the bounds in the UK where they go around the parish in part to memorize the area of the village. Yes. So that would be a great example of a kind of unique celebration that can showcase both what the characters are doing and what is going on within the culture and within the village life and everything else. And that can also, of course, form a part of your plot and story. So, if we're talking about festivals, what are we really talking about? Obviously, you can have regular or repeating festivals like our New Year's or Christmas or so on. So, I use this in my world where I have a festival every 3 months. I have a quarterly festival that separates my year into 4 chunks of time: the Festival of Fire, which is midwinter, the Festival of Flowers, which is at the start of spring, the Festival of Berries, which is midsummer, and then the Festival of Leaves, which is mid-autumn. Jacqueline Carey has this, where they do the longest night celebration. It's just an annual celebration of midwinter. Raymond E. Feist has got the Feast of Banapus, which is a midsummer ritual and is also the time when everyone in Midkemia is counted to be 1 year older. So you can definitely lean into that kind of annual or regularly occurring festival. On the other hand, you can also do singular events. So, for example, the coronation of a monarch would be a singular festival or ritual. You could also do a banquet that is held in honor of a hero or something that celebrates a specific person. Looking again to Jacqueline Carey, at the end of the third book, the heroine Phaedra organizes a citywide celebration and banquet for her childhood friend Hyacinth that celebrates him as an individual and is obviously a once-off festival. You can also do this in terms of religious ceremonies or specific rite ceremonies. A royal wedding is a good example, as John McCulloch says. Also in Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wirtz's Daughter of the Empire, which is a ritual we will look at during this stream, there is a religious ceremony, a ceremony of induction for the for entering the priesthood. And there's also, of course, rites of passage, like we'll also look at Ged's rite of passage when he enters into the school at Roke from Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea. Of course, speaking of individuals, festivals and rituals can also celebrate it can celebrate moments of life. So things like births, birthdays, marriages, funerals, etc. So in George R.R. Martin, the king is buried after he dies from getting bored in the hunt. Good old Robert. Martin never showed the actual funeral, but the discussion between Ned and Robert when Robert was dying, I know that it's a touching moment, but it's also funny because Robert's like, serve the boar at my funeral feast with the apple in its mouth and make sure you eat it even if you choke on it. Which to me was just, it was funny. It struck me as funny. So you can certainly do those kind of moments of life, those moment as part of a celebration and a ritual and a rite. Okay, so we've covered what type of festival, we've covered why they're important. Let's talk about how you make a festival and whether you decide that it's going to be an excuse to shut down a street and roll in food trucks. Absolutely, Bram. Okay, so festivals should have an origin story. Every ritual or festival usually has some kind of story behind it, an explanation for why it's being celebrated. This can be tied to historical events, religious belief, or the natural cycle of the fantasy world. An example of this from fantasy writing, Anne McCaffrey has her impression in the Dragon Riders of Pern series, where the dragon eggs hatch on the dragon sands, and they hatch at irregular intervals because they hatch, obviously, the dragon laid them, and then they're like sitting there in the hot sands until they hatch. Now, because it's a irregular occurring thing, but it's a very big thing because it brings new dragon riders to the fore, and these people now they bond with the dragons on a permanent basis. So you can have such a festival that is centered in a specific need. There needs to be dragons born. Those dragons need to bond with the riders, and that creates the origin of the festival. Or you could have, for example, it tied to the natural world, sure, the way that we have here in the Nordics with Midsummer, which we celebrate every year. But the way that it's celebrated is also then tied to its historical context. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to turn to my own writing and talk about the Festival of Fire, which I open my second book with. So I'm going to flip to my screen sharing scene. Let me know if anything weird happens with the sound. And I'm just going to read the opening scene of the Ducal Heir Chapter 2. With his daughter's little hand curled in his, Louis approached the giant bonfire blazing on the ice. Louisa's mittened fingers could touch the back of his hand. She had grown so much since the last winter festival. How much more of her life would he miss this coming year? He pushed the painful thought away. Duty cared nothing for his role as a father. The flames reared up into the polar night, forming the shape of the great wheel. The frigid heart of the northern winter stole all heat from the blaze. Memories crowded his throat, a myriad of flame festivals gone by, aspirations for the new year rising in a tower of smoke. Gathered around him, other denizens of Rakai Fortress watched the dancers gyrating in the hub of the wheel, wraith-like among the flames. Deep drum beats jolted through their bodies as they bid farewell to the old year and welcomed the new. Acrid, oily fumes rose from their fire staves. The aroma lingered in the air, a sour note in the otherwise crisp winter night. Snow-shrouded walls loomed behind them, the long shadow of Rakai Fortress reaching across the frozen lake. "Have you got your wish?" Louis asked his daughter. "Yes, Papa." She held up a small wooden carving, little boots slipping as they stopped. Louis thought that it might represent a house, though not a very well-crafted one. His 8-year-old had a lot to learn about woodworking. "It's time to send it to the wheel." "Can I tell you my wish, Papa?" she asked softly. "If you whisper it very quietly so the spirits don't hear it." He dropped to one knee and adjusted the hood of her reindeer parka so that it sheltered her red hair, so reminiscent of his own russet locks. She leaned close to him, holding the carving between them. Her little lips brushed soft on his ear. "I wish that you didn't have to go anywhere this year, that you can just stay at Rakai with us." Louis hugged her, sorrow burning behind his eyes. There was little else he could do. Her wish would not be granted. The drums echoed their shared heartbeat in the tight space between them. He savoured her breath against his cheek, small arms coiled around his neck. This memory, at least, they would both carry before duty called him away. "Come, Louisa," he rose reluctantly. "It's time to make your wish, and then we can feed the fire." So, what I did here with this festival was I had multiple layers of things. Because it is midwinter and it is dark, they have the fire dancing as a celebration of the light returning, because obviously it's the time when the sun starts to tilt and you start having the light, the days get a little bit longer again each day. And what I also did was I had a specific activity of sharing your wishes for the new year, and by carving an item and throwing it into the fire that is part of this whole celebration. And the origin for that came from the Rulara funeral traditions, which I show way later in the third book, where they would carve a memory of a person, like a memory of what that person meant for them, and they would cast that into the fire in memory of the person that has died. So that kind of links these two and forms the tradition of the New Year's ceremony of putting your wish in the fire. And then I also try to show that to the readers in a way that keeps them engaged, because obviously we make New Year's resolutions at New Year's. So, and this is my New Year's festival, my equivalent New Year's festival as well. So I wanted to kind of lean into that and make readers feel grounded in the festival by tying it back to that kind of wish for the new year. So that is origin stories of your festival. So when you're designing your festival, think about where your traditions come from and how they come about and what they mean to the people in the world. The next thing that you should think about when you're designing festivals is the symbols and iconography. So in our world, as an example, we're creeping up on Halloween quite fast, and pumpkin and skeletons are, of course, associated with Halloween. But in a fantasy culture, in your culture, what would be associated with the festivals? From Jacqueline Carey's work, The Longest Night is her most important celebration, without a doubt. It's got a lot of very, very specific iconography associated with it, specifically around the Sun Prince. And here we're also going to talk about how she used the Sun Prince multiple times in her plot. Now, I'm going to read from the text of Jacqueline Carey's first book, A Shield's Dart, to sort of demonstrate the origin of The Longest Night, and then I'll discuss how she used that politically. So we're jumping right in here. It's Phaedra's perspective. She is the first person narrator. The trumpet sounded once more, and everyone, duanes, royalty, and adepts alike, drew back along the colonnade, for this sounded the entrance of the Winter Queen. She entered alone, hobbling. It is said that the mask of the Winter Queen was made 400 years ago by Oliver the Oblique, so sublime a master of the craft that no one knew his true features. Of a surety it was old, wafer-thin layers of leather soaked and moulded into the likeness of an ancient crone, painted and lacquered until it mocked not life, but the preservation of it. An old grey mare's tail wig crowned her head, and she was shrouded in grey rags. A dingy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. This, then, was the Winter Queen. Everyone bowed as she entered the great hall, and those of us kneeling bowed our heads. She hobbled to the head of the colonnade, leaning on an old blackthorn staff, and turned to face the crowd. Straightening only slightly, she hoisted her staff aloft. Trumpets blared, people cheered, and the musicians struck up a merry tune. The midwinter masque had begun. So here we have the very clear iconography of the midwinter queen and the winter queen entering. And then later, after the dancing and the feasting and so on, the Sun Prince enters to demonstrate the year gone by. So this happens at midnight when obviously you have the sun start its turning process. So we're going to pick up the narrative from there. From behind the screen, the Winter Queen re-emerged, leaning on her blackthorn staff, hobbling to the head of the colonnade. Someone cheered and was silenced. Everyone looked toward the fast-shut doors at the great hall, awaiting the Sun Prince. Once, twice, thrice, from the far side a spear butt rapped upon the doors, and they fell open at the third blow, with a shivering sound from the musicians' timbales. He stood in the doorway, the Sun Prince. He was a vision in cloth of gold, gilding his doublet and hosen, even his boots. His cloak was cloth of gold, falling to sweep the parquet floor as he entered. The mask of a smiling youth, gleaming with gold leaf, hid his face, and its rays hid his head. I heard murmurs and speculation as he strode the length of the colonnade, gilded spear in hand. At the head of it he bowed, but as he rose, so did the head of his spear, sweeping up to touch the breast of the Winter Queen. Bowing her head, she let fall her blackthorn staff. It clattered in silence. With both hands she raised her mask and swept the wig from her head, shrugging free of her encumbering rags and shawl. I gasped, for the Winter Queen was young and beautiful, and she was Soraya. But the mask was not done. The Sun Prince dropped to one knee, grasping the hand of the Winter Queen. In one swift motion he drew forth a ring and thrust it upon her finger, harshly, for I saw her wince. He rose then, grasping her hand, and turned to face the crowd. When he lifted his mask, we saw it was Prince Bowden. Now, the reason why that event was important and that iconography was important is tied back to Jacqueline Carey's plot and setup of this festival. So the origin of this festival is that the Sun Prince marries the land by taking the Winter Queen to wife. It is a ancient sign of rulership and dominion. Prince Bowden is not the crown prince. The crown prince is actually the crown princess, Ysandra, who at this point in the story is like 8 years old or 9 years old. And so what Prince Bowden is doing here is he is usurping the Sun Prince's role and making a very subtle play for claiming the land, kind of saying, you know, maybe I should be the heir to the throne instead. And indeed, later on in the books, there is a plot where he is involved in that, well, things happen. I don't want to spoil it all for you, but it's a foreshadowing move. Now, the second time that Jacqueline Carey uses this is actually in the second trilogy, in the Imriel trilogy, where the actual crown princess, Sidonie, usurps the Sun Prince's role in wearing a costume to the Midwinter Masque that is exactly like the Sun Prince's. And thereby she tells the peers of the realm that despite them, you know, not liking her being the crown princess because she is a Dangeline half-breed and not a full-blooded Dangeline, despite them not liking her, she is the legitimate crown prince of the realm, the Dauphin. So that is to my mind an excellent usage of iconography of festivals and a great demonstration of what you can do with festivals and their iconography to really build it into your plot and your character actions. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about the role of magic in festivals. So in my world, I do have magical tides. So the tides of magic run higher during the festivals, which I use in my books as like points where my villains are particularly active, because that provides me with a very definitive ticking clock. You only have until the festival, and then the villain has access to all of this kind of festival magic tiredness, and he will be able to enact his evil plot, kind of thing. But you don't have to be that explicit about it. Ursula Le Guin has a rite of passage into the school of Roke that we see Ged go through, that we see Sparrowhawk go through when he first comes to the island. And I'm going to just briefly read that passage and then talk about it. So we're jumping in here with Ged. In the great building, near one corner, there was a mean little door of wood. Ged went to this and knocked loud. To the old man who opened the door, he said, I bear a letter from the mage Ogion of Gaunt to the warder of the school on this island. I want to find the warder, but I will not hear more riddles and scoffing. This is the school, the old man said mildly. I am the doorkeeper. Enter, if you can. Ged stepped forward. It seemed to him that he had passed through the doorway, yet he stood outside on the pavement where he had stood a moment before. Once more he stepped forward, and once more he remained standing outside the door. The doorkeeper inside watched him with mild eyes. Ged was not so much baffled as angry, for this seemed like a further mockery to him. With voice and hand he made the opening spell which his aunt had taught him long ago. It was a prize among all her stocks of spell, and he wove it well now. But it was only a witch's charm, and the power that held this doorway was not moved at all. When that failed, Ged stood a long while there on the pavement. At last he looked at the old man who waited inside. I cannot enter, he said unwillingly, unless you help me. Then and the old man says to him, sorry, I seem to have miscopied here, but the old man basically tells him he has to say his name, his actual name, which in the context of Earthsea is obviously dangerous because their magic is the magic of naming. So then again, Ged stood still a while, for a man never speaks his own name aloud until more than his life's safety is at stake. I am Ged, he said aloud. Stepping forward, then he entered the open doorway. And then he actually gets into the house. Now, the reason why this rite is the one I wanted to pick here for the role of magic is because there is both magic involved in something you have to overcome, like you have to get into the school in order to be accepted by the school. But unless you can somehow force your way in with, like, if his magic spell had worked or whatever, you ultimately have to give the schoolmasters your name, which is an extreme point of trust on your behalf because you are yielding to them power over you. And this, of course, also makes the schools feel safer because, you know, they're taking in students who can do heaven knows what, and therefore they want that insurance of knowing the pupils' names. So you can work magic into your rites and rituals. And don't forget about rites and rituals. It's not all just about festivals and celebrations. These events also involve those kinds of rites. Then, of course, there are things like food and drink that you should think about. I did do a whole video on festival food and drink, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it in the live stream. When the live stream is available for editing, I'll make an information card for it. But if you check my back content, you will find the whole food and drink video there. Then, in terms of dress and attire is another thing that I want to talk about here. So Obviously, we've already spoken about The Longest Night and their masked ball, but I actually here want to talk about Daughter of the Empire, which is a book written by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wirtz. So, the rite that I'm going to highlight here is the very opening rite in chapter 1 of the book, of the first book of the trilogy, in fact, where Mara, the main character, is being inducted into the Order of Lashima, and what she wears is a very important part of this ritual. So if we flip back to our text, the priest struck the gong. The sound reverberated off the temple's vaulted domes, splendid with brightly coloured carvings. The solitary note echoed back and forth, diminishing to a remembered tone, a ghost of sound. Mara knelt, the cold stones of the temple floor draining the warmth from her. She shivered, though not from chill, then glanced slightly to the left, where another initiate knelt in a pose identical to her own, duplicating Mara's movements as she lifted the white head covering of a novice of the Order of Lashima, goddess of inner light. Awkwardly posed with the linen draped like a tent above her head, Mara impatiently awaited the moment when the headdress could be lowered and tied. She had barely lifted the cloth, and already the thing dragged at her arms like stone weights. The gong sounded again. Reminded of the goddess's eternal presence, Mara inwardly winced at her irreverent thoughts. Now, of all times, her attention must not stray. Silently, she begged the goddess's forgiveness, pleading nerves, fatigue and excitement combined with apprehension. Mara prayed to the lady to guide her to the inner peace she so fervently desired. So, what this rite does is it gives us the religion, it gives us what she's wearing, it gives us something unique she's wearing. Whenever I think of this ritual, I think of the fact that they're wearing these tents that they hold above their heads that will eventually be tied as veils. That is part of the vestments of this Order of Lashima. And it sticks in my mind as one of the more memorable things that can be worn by somebody in a festival. So you don't necessarily have to go, full-blown midwinter mask or your weird clothes all around. It can be something as simple as a specific veil or gloves or a specific kind of shirt or some kind of thing that indicates that they are a participant in this ritual and what their role as participant is. So do think about, is there any specific vestments, clothing, and such like? Also, think about specific artifacts. We spoke about the dragon riders earlier. So the dragon eggs are in and of themselves a very specific artifact relevant to the impression rite that the dragon riders go through. So is there something that is part of the ritual? If I think to this day, I've watched Queen Elizabeth's coronation, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, and to this day I can remember that ball in her hand, that ball with a cross on it. I don't know why that thing specifically sticks out to me, but such artifacts can really make the festival memorable in the minds of your reader. But don't go overboard. Don't show too much, because then you're going to crowd everything out of your reader's mind. Pick like one or two things and then build that into your festival as like an artifact or as like specific clothing that they wear. And then I do want to talk here briefly about what kind of activities happen at the festival. I mean, we've already seen this in the Midwinter Masque, we've seen it in my festival, but there are many activities that you can potentially do at a festival. The Swedes have this little song that they sing about a frog while they all hop around the maypole, which is just amazing. Um, you can check that out on YouTube. It is extremely funny and awesomely fun if you ever do participate in it. Um, in a fantasy realm, Raymond Feist in the Magician series has the Festival of Benapus, where everyone in Midkemia is considered to be 1 year older on the Festival of Benapus, which is a midsummer festival. And at this festival, the boys who are 14 years old are chosen by the various masters of craft to begin their actual formal training in the craft that they will grow up into, which makes this a very interesting festival that our hero on the Midkemia side, Pug, goes through when he is eventually chosen by the magician at that festival to be the magician's apprentice. And then there's also, for example, George R.R. Martin has the Dothraki wedding, where it's considered dull unless there are at least 3 deaths, which showcases the fierceness of that warrior culture. I was rereading that whole section. I'm not going to read it on YouTube because it is a little bit, violent and so on. And I do like my monetization status being friendly. But you know the section that I'm talking about where there are women dancing for the carl, and then there are men who fight over the women, and there's a variety of fairly violent things that happen. So that is also, you can have such activities that demonstrate very specifically the nature of your culture, as Martin does with the Dothraki weddings. And then the last thing that I just want to very briefly touch on is variations across regions. So as an example of this, if you look at the Nordics, as I said, Sweden's got this maypole thing. They dance around it singing about the little frog and his ears. But here in Finland, we light a bonfire. So don't ask me why we light a bonfire when the midnight sun is in the sky, but we do. So we light a bonfire, and we spend the time with friends and family, and we see in the new year with these big bonfires. So you can have these very different regional celebrations. England, I believe, has the maypole dancing, the actual thing where they go around with the ribbons and so on, which is just the most incredible skill. Like, I find that amazing. I'd love to be able to maypole dance, but I think I don't think I'm in the right part of the world to learn that particular skill. Then, if we look at a fantasy context, again, Jacqueline Carey's got a thing for the longest night. So what she did when Imriel went to Alba, to the England equivalent, is they didn't celebrate the longest night. Instead, they celebrated the next day, the following day, and called it the Day of Misrule, when the commoners were in charge and the nobles served the commoners, and so it was like a topsy-turvy day. And also in her world, there's the Castelline Brotherhood, who are a separate organization from the rest of Terre d'Ange, and they celebrate the longest night by keeping Eloa's vigil rather than participating in the Midwinter Masque. So you can have the same event being celebrated, but it's celebrated in different ways across the regions, which showcases the contrasting cultures. Like the Picti of Alba are more, they're not as invested as Terre d'Ange in these midwinter masks and these shows and so on. For them, it is more about this coming together and this family celebration of fun and laughter. So it's just different celebrations across the same event. That's what I had in mind for talking about for festivals. The chat seems quiet at the moment, so I don't know if anybody has any questions they would like me to hit. I see Bram does have a mention over there of there is the Craft Hall Pern books that also had festivals, yes. Um, but those were sort of feast days, and when the traders of the craft halls sold their wares, so they made their wares generally available. So it was a very economically orientated festival, which of course you can also do. I mean, people selling their wares at feast days is totally like in keeping with, you know, reasons for having a festival. And then I would just like to say thank you to Dylan Buttra, one of my Wood members, for attending the channel. And of course, you can become a channel member and get shout outs on social media and early access to my videos and so on. Or if you want to support the channel in other ways, you can get cool shirts like the one I'm wearing at the moment from my spring store. And otherwise, guys, my cat says hello. She's very cute. And I will see you in 2 weeks for another live stream. And in the meantime, there will, of course, be videos on Tuesday. So I hope you've all enjoyed this in-depth look at festivals in fantasy and why and how to build them and all the rest of that. Okay, bye.